Optimistic nurses playing hero won't override medical consensus. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before Katie Morrison's hands would enter a child's chest cavity and restart his heart with her bare fingers. The pediatric ICU at Cedar Creek Medical smells like antiseptic and institutional defeat. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting everything in a sickly white that makes the living look half dead. Katie keeps her head down while charting vitals with handwriting so precise it looks mechanical, each number a small act of discipline. Her scrubs are standard issue, navy blue, unremarkable. Underneath them, rope burn scars circle both wrists, the kind of scarring that comes from restraints, or from holding something impossible together with bare hands. In her locker in the break room, wrapped in plastic and untouched for 3 years, sits a pair of combat boots caked with Helmand Province sand. The leather is cracked. The soles are worn through in places. She has never explained why she keeps them. She has a habit, a nervous tell, of rubbing her left thumb across her right palm where shrapnel once lodged beneath the skin. The piece is still there, too close to an artery to remove. Sometimes in quiet moments she can feel it, a small foreign weight, a reminder. Nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knows about the shrapnel. Nobody knows about the boots. Her personnel file says she spent 12 years in civilian nursing before arriving here 2 years ago with a master's in trauma protocol and a list of references from hospitals that no longer exist in any database anyone could access. The file does not mention her real name. It does not mention rank. It does not mention that Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison has been officially erased from every military record since a classified operation went wrong in Helmand Province in 2015. At 6:53 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, that erasure ends. The ambulance bay doors burst open at exactly 6:43. Wheels screaming. Radio traffic crackling, 8-year-old male, blunt force trauma to the abdomen, loss of consciousness at scene, estimated blood loss 15% and climbing, ETA for minutes. The paramedics burst through double doors like they were carrying a bomb. They were carrying something worse, a child whose small body was already turning the color of old concrete. Internal bleeding. Catastrophic. The kind of wound that leaves physicians studying the ceiling and asking God questions they have been trained not to ask. Katie saw him before anyone else saw him. She was restocking a crash cart in Bay 3, and moving through the muscle memory of preparation, clamps here, suction there, endotracheal tubes arranged by size like bullets in a magazine. When the sirens hit the building, her hands went perfectly still for 3 full seconds. Just stopped. Her jaw clenched once, barely visible. Then she moved. She moved faster than any nurse should know how to move. By the time the paramedics wheeled the stretcher past, Katie was already standing in the receiving bay, gloves snapped on, trauma shears clipped to her pocket, for setup ready. Her voice came out steady and mechanical. Trauma Bay 1. Get him there. Now. Nobody questioned the command in her tone. Command is a kind of physics. It bends air around itself. People feel it and comply. The boy was 8 years old. His name was Marcus Holland Jr., though no one would use his name for the next 18 hours. He would become instead the bleeding child or the Holland case or, in the way of trauma surgeons, simply the exsanguination. His skin had the waxy pallor of shock. His left eye was swollen shut. His small hands, one of them was missing 2 fingers, the trauma clean and cauterized by the force of impact, lay limp at his sides. And his ears. Both ears held pediatric hearing aids, tiny beige devices barely visible unless you were looking for them, which Katie was, because she had recognized the shape of grief in the way his father moved. General Marcus Holland Sr. was following the stretcher, and his face held the expression of a man who had been trained to survive enemy fire but was about to discover that some things cannot be survived. He was signing frantically with his hands, desperate, automatic gestures that his unconscious son could not possibly see. The general's fingers moved like they were trying to hold his son together through pure will and muscle memory, the sign language of a father communicating with a deaf child, a conversation that had nowhere to land, bouncing off silence. Katie saw that. Saw the general's hands fall slowly to his sides when he realized his son could not see them. saw the moment a warrior understood he had no battle he could fight with weapons. She held his eye for exactly 1 second, a stranger in scrubs, and something in her look, something steady and certain, made him not look away first. Then Dr. Caldwell arrived. He swept in like weather, his white coat pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed at 7 in the morning. He did not run. He walked. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from never having to run, from knowing that the world will simply wait for you to arrive. His eye scanned the trauma bay with a detached assessment of a man cataloging property. He ignored Katie entirely, which was the point. She was the furniture. The hands. The competence that did not require acknowledgement. What do we have? His voice was like old money, expensive and certain. The attending physician, a younger woman named Dr. Chen, stepped forward. 8-year-old male, single-vehicle motor vehicle accident, estimated speed 45 miles per hour. Driver was under the influence. The child sustained blunt force abdominal trauma with active internal hemorrhage. We have 2 large ball lines running, massive transfusion protocol initiated, but the bleeding is not controlled. BP is 68/40 and dropping. We need imaging stat. Caldwell nodded, already making calculations behind his eyes. Call imaging. Alert trauma surgery. Get me pediatric neuro and pediatric cardiology in the building. We need a full team assessment. He turned to the nursing station. And someone find the father. We need to explain what happens next. Katie watched him dispatch his instructions like he was positioning chess pieces. Competent. Absolutely competent. This was the thing about Caldwell that made him dangerous. He was not stupid. He was not incompetent. He was simply a man who had never once in his career encountered a problem that his credentials and connections could not solve. The world had proven him right every single time. He had no idea what was standing behind him, pushing a crash cart, hands steady as surgical lasers. By 8:48 a.m., the conference room on the 5th floor had filled with the kind of medical firepower that hospitals assemble when they have given up hope but must still perform hope for the family. 7 specialists. Dr. Caldwell had called them in personally, assembling a council of credentials like he was building a wall. Pediatric surgery. Pediatric cardiology. Trauma surgery. Interventional radiology. Anesthesia. Emergency medicine. Neurosurgery. Each one of them had arrived with the understanding that Caldwell wanted a consensus. Caldwell always got what he wanted. They stood or sat around a polished conference table with coffee that had already gone cold. Medical imaging was displayed on the wall-mounted screens, CT scans of a child's abdomen that looked like maps of a war zone. The bleeds were everywhere. In the spleen. Along the mesentery. A laceration to the right hepatic lobe that was continuing to produce blood loss despite 2 units of packed red cells and aggressive fluid resuscitation. The boy's small body was a vessel that could not hold its contents. By every measurement that medicine possessed, the situation was impossible. The hemorrhage is too diffuse, said Dr. Hartley, the pediatric surgeon, pointing at the screen with a stylus. Even if we get him to the OR, the moment we open him up, he's going to bleed out faster than we can replace. The transfusion volumes we're talking about, we're already 2 units behind what his body is losing. His coagulation is starting to fail. This is a losing calculation. Caldwell nodded slowly, as though the math was just what he had expected. Prognosis. The room went silent. That particular silence that happens when physicians collectively run out of hope. Silence so thick you could operate in it. Death, said Dr. Hartley finally. Imminent. Within the hour, even with maximum intervention. The injuries are incompatible with survival. The father needs to understand. The father understands nothing, Caldwell interrupted, his voice smooth as oil. The father is a general who has spent his life commanding things. Right now, he is standing outside that boy's room with nothing to command, and he will grasp at any possibility we offer him. So let us be clear with each other about what we are actually saying here. We are saying the child is dying. We are saying that surgery will only accelerate that death. We are saying that any further intervention is prolonging suffering rather than preventing it. He stood up slowly, buttoning his white coat with the precision of ritual. The difficult conversation I will have with the father is that heroic measures are not always humane. That sometimes compassion means allowing death with dignity rather than fighting a battle we cannot win. The specialists nodded. They always did. Caldwell's words had a way of sounding like reality itself, like he was simply stating facts that existed independent of his utterance. This was the power he wielded, not domination through volume, but domination through the tone of someone who had never been wrong and therefore must be right. He walked toward the door. That was when Katie Morrison knocked and stepped through it. She was in her scrubs still, the light blue ones with the small stain on the left shoulder that nobody but Katie would ever notice. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her face was composed, that particular composure that comes from absolute certainty. Caldwell had seen confidence before. He had not seen this. This was something deeper, the kind of calm that does not require external validation because it has already been tested by fire. "My apologies for the interruption," Katie said. Her voice was soft, deferential, the voice of a nurse speaking to physicians. "I was charting the patient's response to the transfusion protocol, and I had a thought about the pediatric trauma research from Johns Hopkins. The experimental protocol for massive hemorrhage in pediatric patients under age 10. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger yet. Annoyance. The annoyance of a man being interrupted during an important moment by someone who had no business interrupting anything. The TXA Cascade Protocol. Katie continued, keeping her hands clasped in front of her, everything about her body language suggesting deference. With the alternative coagulation approach? I ran the mathematics against the boy's current vitals, and if we applied the pediatric variant, there is a possibility the initial hemorrhage could be stabilized enough to bridge him to the OR. It is experimental, and it is unlikely, but the current path guarantees death. The protocol at least offers a probability of survival. One of the surgeons, Dr. Ivius, leaned forward. "What's your background, nurse?" "Trauma ICU. 12 years. She did not mention the other 11 years. She did not mention the rank. She did not mention the fact that she had performed this exact protocol, a version of it, anyway, a battlefield version, on soldiers who had no hope, soldiers who had died anyway but had died with a chance, which was more than they had walked in with. Caldwell smiled. It was the smile of a man who has already decided how this moment would end. "That protocol is experimental," he said, his tone suggesting he was explaining this to a particularly bright child. "That means it has not been approved. That means the hospital's liability exposure becomes astronomical. That means, most importantly, that the data does not support the probability estimates you are quoting. What I am hearing is optimistic hope, which I appreciate, but optimism is not medicine. What I am hearing is a nursing staff unwilling to accept the difficult reality that some patients cannot be saved." He paused. His smile did not waver. Optimistic nurses playing hero won't override medical consensus. He turned back to the assembled physicians. "I will speak with the family in 30 minutes. Comfort care measures only. We will make this as painless as possible." Katie did not flinch. She did not look down. She simply stood there with her hands clasped, absorbing the dismissal the way certain materials absorb impact without breaking. Then Caldwell did something that was meant as a gesture of final authority. "You know, I admire your commitment to this patient. It speaks well of your character." He smiled again. "But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is know when to stop fighting. I suspect you will understand that better after you have been in this field a few more years." He turned to leave. The other physicians began gathering their papers. The conference room started to empty, the decision made, the hierarchy established, the world reordered into its proper arrangement. Katie stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds after the door closed. Then she turned and walked back to the ICU. Her jaw was clenched. Her hands, as she moved through the corridor toward the boys' room, were perfectly steady. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like industrial steam and something that might have been chicken once. Katie sat at the corner table, the one where the night shift nurses always ate, far from the attending physicians with their leather briefcases and wedding rings catching the fluorescent light. Her tray held soup that had gone lukewarm and a sandwich she wasn't eating. Her mind was still in the conference room, still hearing Caldwell's laugh, still feeling the weight of 7 doctors turning away from an 8-year-old boy. The bet didn't matter. She'd faced worse odds in Helmand Province than a cardiologist with an ego the size of San Diego Harbor. But General Holland's face, that helpless expression when Caldwell said the word comfort, that stayed with her. She finished gathering her tray at 1,147 hours, moving through the cafeteria line like a ghost. Around her, the physicians' tables buzzed with the usual hospital gossip. Insurance denials. Malpractice rumors. Someone's affair with someone's ex-wife. Katie paid none of it attention. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was a weapon. Stay quiet. Stay competent. Stay unremarkable. The charts were still in her hand. Updated vitals from the boys' 0600 assessment. Hemoglobin count. Clotting cascade markers. Her recommendations printed in neat Arial font, the Johns Hopkins Protocol, paragraph 3, subsection B. Nothing revolutionary. Just another experimental path that 7 doctors had already rejected. She was walking past the physician's table when she felt the shift in air pressure. Caldwell stood. Not slowly. Not casually. He rose like a man who'd just been handed an insult disguised as a question, his chair scraping against tile loud enough that a surgical resident 3 tables over looked up. He stepped directly into Katie's path, his hand already reaching for the tray. Still here. His voice carried across the entire cafeteria, that particular tone of false surprise, the kind a man uses when he knows 47 people are watching. Still playing doctor. Katie didn't have time to shift her weight. His hand connected with the bottom of her tray and flicked upward with the precision of someone who'd practiced casual cruelty. The tray left her grip. Soup went airborne in a golden arc. The plastic bowl tumbled, hit the tile with a wet slap, and scattered vegetables across a 10-foot radius. Bread soaked through. The metal tray bounced once and settled with a ringing sound that didn't quite die. The cafeteria went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. There was a difference. Quiet was deliberate. Quiet meant people were watching and deciding whether to pretend they weren't. Caldwell plucked the charts from her other hand, not asking, not reaching politely, just taking them the way you'd remove a dangerous object from a child. He held them up to the light as if checking for authenticity, then turned and threw them toward the windows. The pages separated mid-air like a flock of startled birds, scattering across 3 tables and sliding under chairs. "Pick that up, sweetheart." He said it with a smile, teeth showing. "That's actually your job." Katie's jaw clenched. Once. A muscle jumped in her right cheek like a nerve firing, just visible enough that the surgical resident from 3 tables away would remember it later. Her hands, though, her hands stayed perfectly still. She didn't ball them into fists. She didn't shake. She didn't pull air through her teeth in a hiss of rage that wanted so badly to escape her chest. Instead, she knelt on the tile floor while 50 people watched, and she began to gather the scattered pages. Soup soaked through her scrubs at the knee. She didn't acknowledge it. Page 1, slightly damp. Page 2, folded corner. Page 3, which had landed under a physician's assistant's shoe and come away with a dark footprint. She stacked them in order, her movements methodical and precise, the kind of precision that came from training. Not the training of hospitals. The other kind. When she stood, her scrubs were wet from thigh to ankle. She held the stack of pages against her ribs and looked directly into Caldwell's eyes for exactly 1 second. Not a challenge. Not fear. Just acknowledgement. The kind of stare a person learns to give in places where words get people killed. Then she turned and walked toward the nurse's station. Behind her, conversation started again. Gradually. Carefully. No one would mention this later. No one would file a complaint. That wasn't how the hierarchy worked at Cedar Creek Medical. Caldwell was the voice that mattered. He was the one with 7 specialties on his team and a salary that started with 6 figures. Katie Morrison was the one in the wet scrubs, walking alone across a tile floor. She printed new copies of the charts at the station, the scanner humming its mechanical song, pages sliding out warm and crisp. Her hands were steady. That was the part that would matter later, the thing that would stick in the memory of a man watching from the doorway. The emergency that night came at 2,143 hours, just after the shift change. A 63-year-old male admitted with a stab wound to the upper thigh, femoral artery nicked but not severed. The trauma resident on call froze the second the patient hit the trauma bay, not panic, not dramatic collapse, just that particular paralysis of a doctor who knew exactly how bad it could get and didn't know what to do about it. The arterial bleed was controlled with direct pressure, but the wound edges wouldn't approximate cleanly. The resident kept starting to stitch and stopping, checking his work 3 times, 4 times, his hands moving like they were underwater. In and out. In and out. Wrong angle. Katie was there because arterial bleeds meant ICU transfer, and she was always the one who prepped the bed. She stood in the corner of the trauma bay, watching the resident's hands, watching the clock on the wall mark 21:47, watching the blood seep through gauze that should have held. Need help? She asked it quietly. Not to the resident. Not to the attending. Just into the air, a question without a target. The attending was in charting. The resident was too deep in his own head to hear her. No one moved. Katie crossed the distance between the corner and the table in 4 steps. May I? She asked, and it wasn't really a question either. She held out her hand for the needle. The resident, grateful and embarrassed in equal measure, handed it over without speaking. She picked up the suture where he'd left it, a 4.0 Proline, which was correct, and looked at the wound for exactly 2 seconds. Then her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. Tension at 45 degrees. Entry point at the lateral edge, deep enough to catch the arterial wall but shallow enough to avoid the nerve bundle. She'd done this in a field hospital in Cedar Province in 2009, done it by headlamp while mortar fire walked across the compound outside. This was nothing. This was clean. This was quiet. The stitches went in like a metronome. 7 layers. Each one perfect. The wound edges came together as if they'd been waiting for her hands to find them. A former Army combat medic named Holloway was working patient transport that night. He'd been wheeling the 63-year-old toward the ICU when the trauma bay doors opened and he'd watched Katie work from the doorway for exactly 34 seconds. Just long enough. He stopped moving. The gurney stayed where it was while he stared at her hands, not the way a person watches a nurse work, but the way a soldier watches a ghost walk through a wall. Recognition flickered across his face like a match striking in darkness. His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer without moving his feet, just tilted his weight forward, and his jaw tightened with the weight of something he was trying to remember. Katie tied off the final suture. She held the needle steady for the resident to take back, and she turned. Holloway was in the doorway, framed in fluorescent light, and their eyes met for exactly 1 second. She shook her head. Small movement. Almost invisible. Holloway swallowed. His mouth opened, and then closed. He backed out of the trauma bay without a word, took the gurney's handles, and continued toward the ICU like a man who'd just seen something he wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Katie set down the needle. She stripped off her gloves. The palm of her right hand, the one she'd pressed against her sternum 3 days ago, the spot where scar tissue told its own story, felt cold underneath the latex. That was. The resident started. I need some jello, Katie said quietly. The starch settles my stomach after shifts. She turned away before he could finish speaking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 02 for 7 hours, when the boy's monitor went wild. The alarm shrieked at 2:24 a.m. A single high-pitched wail that cut through the ICU like a blade. Katie's eyes snapped open. She wasn't asleep, she never fully slept during a shift, but the sound still moved her from the charts to the hallway in 4 seconds flat. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The overhead lights flickered with that fluorescent hum that made her teeth ache, and the monitor in room 412 was screaming. The boy. Holland's son. His chest heaved against the ventilator, the rhythm fractured, desperate. Katie was through the door before the resident on night shift even stood up. The machines sang their terrible song, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation plummeting, heart rate climbing past 180 and still accelerating. "Get me his attending," Katie said. Not a question. The flat command voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though she hadn't used it in 5 years. "Call the overnight team." All of them. The resident, a third-year named Torres who still trembled when things went wrong, fumbled for the phone. Katie's hands were already moving. She checked the ventilator settings, the 4 sites, the catheter position. Everything was correct. Everything was failing anyway. The boy's abdomen was rigid, distended. Internal bleeding. The kind that doesn't announce itself politely. It waits until 2:27 a.m. and then tears through your system like a detonation. BP 62/38, Katie called out, her voice the only steady thing in a room full of screaming machines. She could feel Helmand Province blooming at the edge of her vision, the darkness of a medevac helicopter, the smell of copper and diesel fuel, hands moving inside a Marine's abdomen while rounds punched through the fuselage. But she breathed. Just breathed. The pass stayed where it belonged. Torres's hand shook as he dialed. "Dr. Chen? Dr. Patel?" Code blue in for 12, internal bleed, vitals cascading. All 7 should come. They came. Of course they came. The ones who'd declared the boy's case hopeless, who'd written their names on the prognosis like it was scripture. Dr. Caldwell arrived last, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone utterly certain of his authority. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He already knew what the ending looked like. "Sinus rhythm?" he asked, not moving closer to the bed. Katie didn't look up. "Deteriorating. Rhythms becoming erratic. Internal hemorrhage is massive." One of the cardiologists, Dr. Patel, checked the monitor and shook his head. "We need to get him to surgery." "Surgery won't help," Caldwell said flatly. "Look at his pressures. Look at his labs. His hemoglobin is at 5.2. He's lost nearly all his circulating volume. The damage is too extensive." "We don't know that until," Katie started. "We do know." Caldwell's voice had that terrible certainty, the kind of tone that shaped a room. "The child is exsanguinating from a traumatic injury that's already hours old. Operative intervention is futile. We manage comfort care, Anne." The monitor flatlined. Not a gradual rhythm strip. Not a warning. A straight line. A sentence ending mid-word. Katie moved. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with the luxury of time. She had maybe 4 minutes before the boy's brain started to die, and her hands had already crossed that threshold into muscle memory. Her body had done this before. Her hands had held lives together while mortars fell, while helicopters screamed, while the world was nothing but blood and urgency and the absolute refusal to let someone die on your watch. "Crash cart," she said. Not requesting. Commanding. 12 ccs of epi, 1 milligram. "I'm going open." "That's unauthorized," Caldwell started. Katie was already tearing the bandages away from the boy's abdomen, already prepping the surgical field with antiseptic that hissed as it touched skin. She didn't have time for the operating room. She didn't have time for protocols. She had 4 minutes and a dead child. The scalpel sliced downward. First incision, clean and perfect. The second parallel line. A third across the ribs. A fourth to open the pericardium. For cuts made with the precision of someone who'd done it in the dark, who'd done it while explosions rocked the fuselage, who'd done it because the only other option was to watch someone die. A rib spreader. The ratchet clicked as she cranked it, opening the chest cavity, exposing the heart. It lay there, flaccid and useless, a muscle that had forgotten how to beat. Internal paddles, 200 joules, Katie called out. Torres moved without questioning. He understood authority when he heard it. But she didn't wait for the paddles. Her hands were already inside the chest. Her bare hands, gloved, slick with blood, reaching for the heart. Her fingers found the ventricle and began direct cardiac massage, squeezing the muscle itself, feeling it respond under her palms like a bird's wing in a cage. Pressure. Rhythm. Count. Release. Pressure. Rhythm. Count. Release. She could see the arteries, the coronary vessels branching like dark trees. She could feel the muscle trying to wake up, trying to remember what it was supposed to do. This wasn't from textbooks. This was from memory. This was from the night in San Juan Valley when a 19-year-old Lance Corporal from Tennessee took shrapnel and the only surgical team available was Katie and a field medic named Gator and absolutely nothing else. Epi, 1 milligram, she said, her voice level, inhuman. Push it now. Torres injected the medication into the 4. Katie felt the chemical surge through the coronary arteries, watched the heart muscle shiver and contract. Once. Twice. A third time, weaker. She adjusted her hand position, angling differently, feeling for the sweet spot where pressure became power. Behind her, Caldwell was on his phone. "I need the board president," she heard him say. "Now. I have a nurse performing unauthorized surgery on a pediatric patient in the ICU." Katie heard every word. Her face remained a mask, but her hands understood what was happening. They understood that the man on the phone was already building a case, already activating networks, already calling in favors to make sure she disappeared for this moment of salvation. The heart convulsed. Stabilized. Began to beat. "We have a rhythm," Dr. Chen whispered. Not disbelief. Just observation of the impossible. Katie withdrew her hand slowly, checking the monitor. The rhythm was weak but present, a sinus beat establishing itself, the waveform climbing back toward life. She called for sutures, for drainage tubes, for the equipment to close a child's chest back together before infection killed what her hands had just saved. Her gloves were soaked red. Blood on her forearm, droplets on her scrubs, the smell of it thick and animal and familiar. She was home and she was somewhere else entirely. She was in San Diego and she was in Helmand Province and she was standing in the space between two lives wondering which one was real. "I want her references from all 3 previous hospitals," Caldwell was saying into his phone. His voice carried deliberately, meant to be heard. "Pull her file. Contact the patient safety investigator. I have her on footage performing an unauthorized thoracotomy on a pediatric patient without surgical team, without anesthesia, without." But the heart kept beating. The monitor kept beeping. The boy's oxygen saturation climbed to 88, then 92, then 94. General Holland, who had been standing frozen in the doorway for the last 5 minutes, made a sound like something breaking inside his chest. Katie finished closing the surgical field with the same precision she'd opened it. For stitches. Drain placement. Sterile dressing. She stripped off her gloves and set them carefully in the medical waste, then wiped blood from her forearm with a towel that turned pink in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped steadily, another patient, another life, another universe where things were normal and doctors made decisions and nurses followed protocols and children didn't almost die at 2:36 a.m. Security arrived in 9 minutes. 2 officers with badge scanners and the careful politeness of people enforcing policy, not judgment. "Ms. Morrison, you need to come with us." Katie nodded once. She looked at the boy, at General Holland, at the 7 doctors standing silent in the background. At Caldwell, who was already composing another email on his phone, who had spent the last 3 minutes documenting her destruction instead of witnessing her salvation. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice, not humor exactly, but the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She walked out past them, leaving wet footprints on the tile, leaving the boy's heart beating behind her like a countdown to everything else falling apart. The corridor was silent. Just the sound of her boots on tile, the fluorescent hum, the distant wail of another siren pulling up to Cedar Creek's emergency bay. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was coming. Dr. Caldwell pushed through the ICU doors at 2:53 a.m., coffee in hand, ready to document another casualty in his war against incompetence. But the monitors told a different story. The boy's oxygen saturation climbed steadily, 68, 74, 81, 88. His heart rhythm steadied into a perfect sinus rhythm on the screen above. Katie stood at the bedside, hands steady as surgical lasers, chest tube secured, the lateral thoracotomy incision packed and controlled. Blood pressure rising. Core temperature stabilizing. The child was alive because a nurse had done the impossible. Caldwell's coffee cup hit the tile floor. He didn't stay to watch. He didn't ask questions. He turned and walked back down the corridor, already pulling his phone from his pocket, already composing the narrative that would bury her. By 3:17 a.m., he'd called the hospital board president, Marcus Chen, his medical school mentor from 32 years ago, the man who'd written the letter that got him hired at Cedar Creek. "We have a serious problem," Caldwell said, his voice controlled, reasonable, the voice of a concerned colleague. A nurse just performed an authorized open cardiac surgery on a pediatric patient. It's a liability nightmare. Chen listened. Chen agreed. By 4:44 a.m., Caldwell had contacted Katie's previous 3 hospitals, St. Jude's in Chicago, where she'd worked for 14 months, Mercy General in Seattle, where she'd stayed 18 months, Mount Sinai Grace in Washington, D.C., where her employment had lasted exactly 16 months before she'd left without notice. He asked leading questions to each supervisor. Did you ever have concerns about her judgment? Any incidents where she overstepped her authority? Any complaints from attending physicians? He wasn't asking for information. He was planting seeds, suggesting patterns, constructing the shape of a problem. The patient safety investigator, a woman named Reeves whom Caldwell had worked with for 7 years on 3 previous incidents, returned his call at 6:42 a.m. "I'll need to see the video footage," she said. Caldwell already had it queued. He walked her through every frame, Katie approaching the crash cart without authorization, Katie breaking sterile protocol, Katie's hands inside a child's chest cavity without attending physician orders, Katie playing hero while 7 board-certified specialists stood helpless. "The question isn't whether she saved him," Caldwell explained, his tone like a disappointed professor. "The question is whether we can survive the liability of letting her practice. 1 complication, 1 infection, 1 septic event, and Cedar Creek's insurance doesn't cover it because she wasn't authorized." By 9:15 a.m., Caldwell had assembled a file. Documentation. Video evidence. A pattern across 3 hospitals. By noon, Katie was sitting in a windowless basement office with a woman from HR named Susan who read from a tablet with the cadence of someone reading a grocery list, gross insubordination. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Violation of attending physician orders. Refusal to follow chain of command. Katie's badge sat on the table between them, already deactivated by security, the magnetic stripe dark and useless. Through the door, she could hear Caldwell's voice in the hallway, speaking to someone, a hospital administrator, she thought, walking them through the documentation with the precision of a prosecutor building a murder case. "I have written statements from all 7 specialists confirming they did not authorize this procedure," Caldwell was saying. His voice carried the tone of a man delivering justice. "I have video evidence. Her personnel file shows a pattern, 3 hospitals in 4 years, each with questions about boundary issues, each with unexplained departures." Katie signed the termination paperwork without reading it. There was no point. She knew what it said. Effective immediately. For cause. Ineligible for rehire. She'd built a life as someone invisible, and invisibility was a luxury only as long as you stayed small. The moment she'd stepped out of that boundary, the moment she'd let the mast slip, everything collapsed. The walk through Cedar Creek took for minutes. 2 security guards flanked her, their presence an announcement louder than any loudspeaker. Staff stopped talking mid-sentence. Residents stared. A nurse she'd worked with for 8 months, Sarah, with 2 kids and a mortgage, looked away as Katie passed, understanding that eye contact was no longer permitted. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station watching, arms crossed, vindication on his face like a fresh coat of paint. Katie didn't acknowledge him. She walked past the ICU where General Holland sat at his son's bedside, the boy alive and stable, tubes running from his small chest, the miracle that had cost her everything. The general looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Then Katie kept walking. The badge surrender took 30 seconds. The walk through the lobby felt like walking through deep water. San Diego sunshine hit her face as the front doors opened, bright and indifferent and cutting. She sat in her 2016 Honda Civic in the parking lot for 23 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Her scrubs were still stained with the child's blood. The smell of antiseptic and something darker, copper, fear, human tissue, clung to the fabric. She drove home in silence, took surface streets instead of the freeway, let the traffic lights stop and release her motion like she was a prisoner being released in increments. The house was empty when she arrived at 1:06 p.m. She sat at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that made everything look like a crime scene. Her hand shook for the first time all day, not from fear, but from the long, slow release of adrenaline that had kept her standing upright through 6 hours of being professionally destroyed. She pressed her palms flat against the table. Breathed. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint finally breaking. The back door opened at 2:14 p.m. Her son Marcus burst through, backpack still on his shoulders, school keys in hand. He was 14 and tall enough now that she had to look up to see his face. Mom. His voice carried the confusion of finding something in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why are you home? Are you sick? He dropped his backpack by the door, the way she'd asked him not to do 1,000 times, a small rebellion that suddenly seemed like the most important thing in the world. Katie opened her mouth. No words came. The grief came instead, a wave that started in her chest and moved outward, shoulders shaking, face in her hands, the kind of cry that comes from the deepest place inside, the place that knows the cost of everything and the price of the promises you make to yourself. She cried like a soldier cries when the mission is over and you finally understand what you gave up for it. She cried like a mother who couldn't protect her child from the knowledge that doing the right thing wasn't enough, that saving a life could cost you everything, again. Marcus froze. He'd seen his mother calm through hospital shifts and medic calls, composed through the move from Chicago to Seattle to Washington, D.C. to here. But he'd never seen her break. He dropped to his knees beside her and put his hand on her back, 14 years old and suddenly understanding that some wars don't have winners, just survivors, and the people who love them. What happened? He asked. His voice was small. Mom, what happened? Katie couldn't answer. Not yet. Not in a way that made sense. How do you explain that the system doesn't want heroes, that the hierarchy protects itself, that a man with authority will burn down the evidence of his own inadequacy rather than accept that someone smaller than him could see what he couldn't? How do you tell your child that you saved a life and they fired you for it, that you're a Master Chief Petty Officer with a Navy Cross sitting in a garage safe and a parking lot security badge that says visitor, that the most dangerous thing you can do in a hospital is refuse to be small? She pulled Marcus against her and held him, both of them crying now in the kitchen light that wasn't forgiving, wasn't kind, just light, neutral and absolute and indifferent to the fact that a woman who'd carried soldiers through fire was now unemployed and broken and had no way to explain that everything was about to change again. The lobby doors of Cedar Creek Medical opened at 9:22 a.m., and 14-year-old Marcus Morrison carried something into the hospital that no one expected to see. A shadow box. Military issued. The kind that holds medals and memories and the weight of choices made in places most people never have to go. Marcus didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the security desk, his shoes clicking against the tile in the rhythm of someone who'd watched his mother move through rooms her entire life, purposeful, direct, no wasted motion. The shadow box was mahogany with a glass front. Inside, mounted on navy blue velvet, were 3 medals that caught the morning light in ways that made people stop moving. A Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Below them, a pair of combat boots that had turned the color of old blood and sand, laces still threaded through the eyelets like they'd been worn yesterday instead of 7 years ago. "My mom got fired yesterday," Marcus said to the security desk, his voice steady as a 14-year-old's voice could be when carrying something that heavy. "And they need to see these." The veteran security guard, name tag read Peterson, with a kind of weathered face that said he'd stood watch long enough to know what he was looking at, stared at the shadow box for exactly 2 seconds. His posture changed. His shoulders came back. His hands moved to his sides with the automatic precision of muscle memory that never leaves your body, no matter how many years have passed. "Master Chief on deck," he called out. His voice wasn't loud, it was the kind of carry that comes from standing in formations and learning how sound travels across a parade ground. It moved up the atrium, across the soaring glass ceiling, reached the second-floor balconies where nurses and visitors and doctors turned to look. A Navy captain was visiting a patient on the 3rd floor. He heard it. He was down the stairs in less than 40 seconds, his dress whites moving through the crowd like someone had called his name. He took the shadow box from Marcus's hands with both of his own, the way you handle something sacred, and he opened his mouth to read the citations aloud. Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Helmand Province, October 2017. The lobby was already quieter. But it got quieter still. Silver Star. For gallantry under fire while conducting emergency trauma intervention on 3 personnel sustained catastrophic injuries, Sanjin Valley, August 2016. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else was already texting. The local news vans were parked outside, they'd been there since dawn, trying to get footage of Katie's story, the nurse who'd been escorted out by security for saving a child. Now they'd have something else. Silver Star. For extraordinary bravery during tactical withdrawal under sustained enemy fire, FOB Shank, May 2017. The general emerged from the elevator at the exact moment the 3rd medal was named. He was moving slowly, his prosthetics had been fitted at Walter Reed with the best technology available, but stairs were still work. His 8-year-old son was beside him, holding his hand, hearing aids positioned perfectly so the sound coming from the Navy captain's voice reached him crystal clear. "She saved my life in Helmand," General Holland said. His voice was low enough that people had to lean in to hear it. "I never knew her real name until yesterday. But those are my boots she carried out when she dragged me through enemy fire with my legs gone. 12 kilometers. Under fire the entire distance." The room went silent. Not just quiet. Silent. The kind of silent where you could hear the ventilation system humming, where fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder than they actually did, where no one breathed because breathing felt like it would disturb something sacred. 10 full seconds. That's how long the silence lasted. Someone was counting without meaning to. Then a man in a dark suit stepped forward from the far side of the lobby, badge already visible, the kind of presence that makes the air pressure change. NCIS. He'd been called by Dr. Caldwell at 7 a.m., unknowingly setting the timeline that would end his career. A routine referral for a protected witness compliance check, that's what Caldwell had told him. Just making sure the nurse wasn't deviating from her civilian cover, that she wasn't causing problems. The NCIS agent had spent 4 hours confirming what the medals said. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. Classified service record redacted. Protected status. And then, he'd watched the lobby footage from yesterday, the security tapes that the hospital was already preparing to release, the moment when Dr. Caldwell knocked her food tray across the cafeteria floor in front of 50 witnesses, when he threw her charts in her face, when he screamed about problematic nurses playing hero. That was witness intimidation. That was retaliation against a protected person. That was the kind of charge that federal agencies didn't overlook. Dr. Michael Caldwell, the agent said, and his hand moved to his cuffs with the kind of certainty that said this was already over. You're under arrest for interfering with a protected witness and federal obstruction. You have the right to remain silent. The words that followed were mechanical. Everyone had heard them 1,000 times in movies. No one heard them now. They only heard the sound of the handcuffs closing, the hydraulic hiss of the lobby doors opening as Caldwell was escorted toward a patrol car, his face the color of someone watching their entire life become a video clip that was already being shared on every news station between Los Angeles and San Diego. By 2 p.m., the hospital board president, still in his golf shirt, pulled from Torrey Pines by a call that made his legs feel weak, was standing in the conference room where 7 doctors had declared an 8-year-old's case hopeless. The same room. The same table. He'd pulled patient outcomes. The boy was stable. Neurologically intact. Laughing with his father in the pediatric ICU. A save that shouldn't have existed. He'd also pulled Caldwell's communications. Emails to the board calling Katie problematic staff. Texts to the patient safety investigator calling her insubordinate and dangerous. Messages to her former employers asking if she'd shown instability. Not illegal, none of it technically illegal. But in the light of what the lobby footage showed, in the context of a Navy Cross recipient being escorted out by security, in the knowledge that her surgery had saved a Marine general's son, it looked like a coordinated attack on a decorated veteran. The calculation took 30 seconds. By 4 p.m., the board voted unanimously. Termination for cause. Misuse of institutional resources. Reputational damage to Cedar Creek Medical. The board president read a prepared statement while reporters filmed through the lobby windows, while staff watched from the second-floor balconies, while hospital security walked Dr. Caldwell toward the same doors Katie had been escorted through less than 24 hours earlier. No badge. No goodbyes. His medical license forwarded to the California State Board of Medicine for immediate review. Teaching CPR to community college students was going to feel like the best day he'd had in years, eventually. Right now it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground had disappeared. That night, General Holland's phone had rung. The hospital was offering Katie chief of trauma nursing, immediate reinstatement, back pay, full apology, the whole institutional redemption package. The general had negotiated something better instead. His son squeezed his hand while they talked to the hospital administrator, the boy's hearing aids transmitting every word perfectly. What they negotiated for was a training program. A facility named after someone who'd finally be allowed to use her real name instead of hiding it under scrubs and silence. She didn't answer the phone herself when the hospital called back the second time. The general did. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 22 years understanding the difference between rank and character, between authority and actual leadership. "My son was supposed to die," he said quietly. "You fired the person who saved him. You're lucky I'm not asking for more than you're offering." 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood outside a community college classroom in her Master Chief Petty Officer dress whites. The uniform she hadn't worn in 4 years. The one that had been folded away in a cedar chest, gathering dust like her real identity had been gathering dust, waiting for the moment when hiding wasn't necessary anymore. Through the reinforced glass of the classroom door, she could see Dr. Caldwell teaching CPR to a group of students, maybe 20 of them, all paying attention the way people do when they know they're getting certified to save lives. His hands were showing them the right hand placement. His voice was explaining the compression rate. He looked up once, felt the weight of her eyes on him the way you can feel the weight of eyes that have seen people die and survived it anyway, and something in his face shifted. Not recognition, exactly. Just the understanding that there were consequences, and they wore dress whites, and they had medals on their chest. Katie held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she walked away. That afternoon, Cedar Creek Medical opened the Morrison Combat Trauma Training Wing. The plaque on the exterior was bronze, a pair of combat boots mounted on marble, the ones from the shadow box, polished now but unmistakably the same boots that had carried Katie through Helmand Province. General Holland cut the ribbon. His 8-year-old son stood beside him, his hearing aids picking up his father's voice perfectly as the general spoke to a crowd of journalists and hospital staff and the 7 specialists who had declared his son's case hopeless. "The ones who have seen the worst," General Holland said, looking at Katie, then at his son, then back at Katie again, "often give the most." She stood at the podium in her Master Chief whites and didn't give a speech, she never did, but she shook hands with each of the 7 doctors, and each one apologized, and she accepted with exactly the same composure she'd shown in the cafeteria when Caldwell threw her charts across the room. Jaw steady. Eyes level. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the recognition that power doesn't need to announce itself, that authority isn't something you demand, that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. That night she put the shadow box on the mantel for the first time. The Navy Cross visible. The silver stars catching light. The combat boots from Helmand Province mounted on display, nothing hidden anymore, nothing locked away in garages or safety deposit boxes or the careful architecture of a double life. Her 14-year-old son stood beside her in his dress blues, delayed entry program, swearing in next month, finally understanding why his mom had kept those boots in the garage, why she never talked about before, why some things cost everything and still worth the price you paid. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. But sometimes the world is watching. And when it is, it sees what was always there. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors who save lives in the places no one else will go. Like this video if you believe heroes don't always wear the titles they deserve. Comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position?